I'm the archaeologist at Washington Square Park. I was the archaeologist at Washington Square Park for 9 years on and off. From the very beginning when they did some work around the arch in 2004 until 2013. It's 9 years, right? Yes, it is. And it was a fabulous project because there were so many issues that had to be addressed, but it is not what you all would probably consider traditional archaeology. We didn't have little squares, we didn't use toothbrushes, and I didn't choose where we were going to dig. My job was to be there where they were going to go below 2 feet, because I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know that at least part of Washington Square Park was a burial ground. It was a potter's field from 1797 to 1825. So the question, one of the major questions for parks and HPD was whether any burial was left. Some sources said they had been removed. Some sources said they didn't know. Some sources said they all been moved to the edges. And the question was there anything there? So as I say, I didn't choose where I wanted to dig. I had to be there at a certain point and watch. And sometimes we tested, but mainly we did what we call monitoring. Now, I'm an urban archaeologist, and as I say, it was not toothbrush archaeology. It was backhoe archaeology. In other words, I and people who work with me stood behind a backhoe and watched where they were digging. But before we did that, after being involved in the arch in 2004, I had done a very brief history of the park to understand what we were even finding, which ended up being nothing, actually, because they only went down 6 feet, and it turns out there were about 10 feet of fill in that part of the park, so we found nothing. But when they went on to do the rest of the park, the important thing was, the terrain would be different, and the important thing was what we could find. So my very first step was to do something we called a 1A documentary study. Is anyone here familiar with this kind of thing in urban archaeology? Yes, Matt is, okay.
I was an urban archaeologist.
I'm sorry?
I worked with Geoarchaeology Research Associates on...
Joe?
Yeah. At the project on West End Avenue between 60th and 61st.
Side, on the west side?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know. But these nice people don't know that the first step is to do a 1A documentary study, which is really a sensitivity model. You do research, and I love finding things in the ground, there's no question, I would be an archaeologist, but I also love finding records. Records, we have the advantage as urban archaeologists of having records. It's not like being out in Arizona and you dig and you find Native American remains, which can be beautiful and fascinating, and you figure it out. But we also have records, and those records are phenomenal when you combine them with what you find in the ground. So my very first step was looking at Washington Square Park in an archaeological perspective, was to do a 1A documentary study, as I said. And let me see, maybe I should just start. Oh, we're going to the start. So you all know what Washington Square Park is. Now, I don't know if I should stand.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to do, see if I could dim a couple of
Well, never mind. I'll just leave it a little bit. Okay, so Washington Square Park. Oh, that's better. Yeah, even more. Chelsea, I'm not moving because so that's good. Okay, great. Here's Washington Square Park, and we're right about here, right? Okay, so we all know where we are. And this is what the park looked like in 2005. I'm sure most of you are aware of this. Okay, there is the bocce court. There is Waverly Place, looking north. This is the old comfort station. It was built in 1968. That's the southern part of the park. And of course, the arch and the fountain. And one of the major parts of the project was to move the fountain, which caused great controversy among a lot of people. What I find so interesting, and that in itself was an experience, because people were watching, must have been looking out of windows at everything we did. There'd be reports online about what we found, and I'll tell you a funny story about that. But this is what the park looked like before we started. And one of the aims was to move the designer, George Philonicus, who I think is a very good landscape designer, wanted to move the fountain so it would line up with Fifth Avenue, right? It was all Fifth Avenue, so that when you came down Fifth Avenue, you'd see the fountain. That was one of the things, but that wasn't all of it. I mean, the park needed renovation. I think anybody who'd been in the park. And I'll tell you a very funny story. I was seeing a doctor who was very upset about the park being changed because he had grown up around here, and he said, you know, everyone knew where they had to be. The drug dealers knew where they should be. And I said to him, oh, Dr. Goldberg, don't worry, they'll sort it out. Okay, so my question was, what was it before it was Washington Square Park? So going back, this is something from I.M.P. Stokes, the shows the original land grants, and it's very, oh, sorry. I need to do that a lot. Yeah. What I discovered is that here is Washington Square Park, and there were two land grants in the 1640s to two free people of color, Anthony Portuguese and Emmanuel Trumper. And the question is, did they ever live on their land, or they just owned it? They owned it for years, and in fact, Anthony Portuguese's daughter, Susan, inherited the land, but we don't know if anyone lived there. But the question was, could this be part of the archaeology? One of the issues. And then this brings us up, way up to 1784, and this was the Herring Farm. Oh dear, sorry about that, I'm very good at doing that. This is the Herring Farm, all this, and what I've added here is where the burial ground used to be, which followed the line of the Netta Brook. East of the Netta Brook was the burial ground, west was private land, and this land belonged to Thomas Ludlow, who was a wealthy merchant, and this was where his summer estate was going to be. In fact, in 1789, he apparently was building a house. This is the tax record, that's his house. That's not his house, but that says he's having a house, and it's unfinished. So in 1789, he was building a house. Now remember, the city bought the property in 1797, 9 years later, in order to, or not, my math is not right, but you know, later, to create the burial ground. And part of that was probably because of yellow fever epidemics, and partially because they were closing well, it depends upon how you count. The Alms House had what might be considered a potter's field, but the first official potter's field was in what is now Madison Square Park. And they had to get out of that because there was going to be an arsenal there. So they moved to Washington Square, became Washington Square Park. But meanwhile, there's Mr. Ludlow with his unfinished house and then his house. And what happens? But they have the burial ground next door, which probably did not make him very happy. He lived on Wall Street. This was his retreat. So he and 57 other very wealthy men who owned property in the area created a petition asking the city to please move the burial ground somewhere else. Don't do it here. And the city didn't listen. So Mr. Ludlow was not very happy. Nobody's other people, but particularly Mr. Ludlow. Pardon me?
What does D&D mean?
What does D&D mean?
Just a,
Ditto and ditto. In other words, he's in this also.
oh, I see.
I'm glad you asked that question. And you see, I'm in your way. Why don't you, I don't know where to stand. Okay. Better? So I found this map in the Topographic Bureau, and this was very exciting. It's a manuscript map from 1817. And what this shows me is Mr. Ludlow's property. Here is the burial ground outline. Here is Mr. Ludlow's property. The house, unfortunately, got covered by my circle. There's the house and two outbuildings. But what it also shows is this building in the burial ground, which was the keeper's house, I'm quite sure, for the burial ground, which was very exciting because no one knew what it was, and this showed us where it was. And this is just a schematic of the same thing. Mr. Ludlow, and the keeper. And the burial ground. Now the burial ground went on, and also what this showed is that there was this property here which belonged to a church. Although this was a potter's field, some churches did have burial grounds within the potter's field, and this is one of them. It's now part of it would now belong to the Second Presbyterian Church. And maybe some of you remember what happened let me step back. I've forgotten how to order. Okay, so Mr. Ludlow has this property, and maybe he lived on it for a little bit, and maybe he didn't, but he didn't want to be there. So he rented it out. And who did he rent it out to in 1806? But this man, William Stevens, oh God, I'm blank on his name. Thank you. That's why I put it on, because I knew I'd forget it. Well, thank you very much. William Stevens Smith and his wife, was Abigail Smith Adams Smith, the daughter of the President Adams. He was an attaché to George Washington during the Revolution, and then he worked with, he was an aide to Adams when he met his daughter. He made a lot of big mistakes, particularly with money, and so the Adamses were not very happy with him. That's just an aside. So they rented the house from 1806 to 1811, I believe, and I don't know if they ever lived there. He would actually live in the customs house. That was his job at that time, he was master of the customs, but they may have used this as a retreat or not. They were right next to the burial ground. I don't know why he rented it, except, I'll tell you in a little bit. This is the elm tree, the hanging tree supposedly. Now, maybe you all know something I don't know, but I did research to find out who had been hanged in Washington Square Park or the burial ground. There's only one person, and it wasn't from the elm tree, and we'll get into that. So I don't know how that got that reputation. Maybe during the Revolutionary War there were hangings, but none that are recorded.
Is that still there?
Yes. In fact, they trimmed that tree to save it. It's in the northwest corner, I believe. And this is the only person that's documented as having been hanged at, Washington Square Park. Her name is Rose Butler. She was a young black slave, and her master's house burned, and she was accused of arson. Arson, murder, and treason were the three things that you could be hanged for. It was in 1819. And they kept her alive in jail for a long time, hoping that she would reveal her accomplices, which she never did, because whether she had them or not, whether she had anything to do with the burning or not, we'll never know. But she was, they did build a gallows, a temporary gallows. There was no permanent gallows in the park, and she was hanged. And there was a question whether it was actually in the park, based on newspaper accounts, or near the park, or was she buried near the park, was she in the burial ground, sorry. And it turns out that I did find out that she was buried very close to where the gallows had been. Well, this is something that was very interesting when it came to how the burial ground might have been configured, because in 1824, just about 1 year, in fact, almost exactly a year before the burial ground closed in May 1825, there was this article in the newspaper called The Resurrectionist, and it was about a man who was drunk and gotten into Washington Square Park. I keep doing that, into the Potter's Field, and he was trying to steal graves. He was burials. He obviously was a student, a medical student, and he was caught by the keeper and his guard and put in jail. And at the bottom it doesn't say it, but this was called a cautionary tale. And so I then knew that based on this account that they were stacked burials. They weren't just single burials, they were stacked, at least around the edge where this guy had jumped in and couldn't and was having trouble getting out until the dog went after him and then he got out real fast. So this is what we had. This is a map that I put together about the properties that in Washington Square Park going back. There's the original Washington Square Park. No, the burial ground, the Potter's Field. There's the original Potter's Field. Then there were these 4 pieces of property that were not part of it. So there was this little island that wasn't. Greenwich Lane became Art Street and is now Washington Square North. And then after the burial ground closed in 1825, these gores were sold to the city, and this property was sold, making our rectangular square of Washington Square Park. And right after, I always find it interesting they call it Washington Square when it should be called Washington Rectangle, but that's okay. And the thing about, so this happened, they got this land after it closed with the idea of turning the burial ground and this extra property into a parade ground. I would guess that they didn't want to develop there because there were burials in the park. That's just my guess. Nobody has ever said that, but I assume that that's one of the reasons. Now this park went through a great deal before it became a park. When it was a burial ground, they ran a culvert through here to culvert Minetta Brook. They took soil from the ends that was high and dumped it here because it was obviously a swampy area around the brook in order to make it more room for burial. So there was a great deal of disturbance before while it was a burial ground. Well, I find this very interesting because this map has been shown as what the parade ground looked like in, let's say, 1829. And I find that very interesting because this is a terrible, look at those, I mean, what would they do with all those pads, right? And one other thing that I found was this original map showing what the parade ground actually did look like in 1829. This was, in fact, and this one makes sense because it's quite simple. It's got pads and it's got the center, but there's plenty of room to do the parade or whatever is going to happen there, the maneuvers. This was a great find because this is what the parade ground plan was. There's more to this that says that this is what was done, this was the survey, and this is what was accomplished. And this is the parade ground the way an artist's conception of what the parade ground would look like. That's NYU over there.
Is that so?
That would be, I think that's
What,
DC? Yeah, one of the first buildings. And I will tell you that there probably were burials found when they built NYU, because the burial ground did not stop right where it stops now, but we'll never know. They didn't have all the environmental laws that we have to find out, so. Okay, so it's becoming Washington Square Park. When you become a parade ground, that's the beginning. This is the Washington Square Park in the 1850s, and then it does have that configuration that you saw on the other one with the paths intersecting and everything, and the fence that went up in 1849. And this was a police shelter that was put up in 1872, and there was a woman's cottage, they called it, which was, I guess, like a comfort station, that would look the same. The Swiss cottage is what it was called. These are things that became important to me, like what might I find traces of when they're digging up? And if that was a comfort station, what might the toilet facility be? There was no water in the park, so might it be this earth closet, which it certainly could be because they had them in Central Park in the 1870s. Or could it have been this school sink with lots of compartments that was water cleansed but not ideal? So those were things that I wished to know. Might we run into any of this? Well, in 1889, Sanford White built a wooden arch right up Fifth Avenue from the park. And it was such a big success that they decided to do the arch as we know it today. These are children playing around the construction in 1890, but what was most interesting to me is that in 1890, during this construction, they found burials 10 feet down while they were digging for the arch. And what was also very interesting, and I didn't quite understand this, but they also found gravestones and coffins. Now this is a potter's field. By definition, it is for the poor and the unknown. And here were coffins, and here were tombstones. They were broken. I don't think they couldn't tell what it was. And there was a great deal. We read this at the time. This is in the New York Times. You can look it up. Someone said, "Oh, it was a German church," which was not true. It's amazing what people say, to explain things, but that was not true. And I do know now what it was, but you have to look. Well, another thing that I found is this 1965 article about Con Edison working in Washington Square East and finding a burial vault with 25 burials inside. Does anybody remember what happened a year ago when they were digging in the same street? Yeah, it wasn't a surprise to me because I knew it was there, but it obviously was a little bit of a surprise to those who were doing it. And I was not involved in that part of the project, although I think this. And this is a close-up of the map showing where it was, and it's exactly where it still is.
Right.
Sorry? Because people don't pay attention. If they read my report, it's right. This is and this is where it was found. Basically like the old map, so it's part of the burial ground that was up, off to the side with the Presbyterian burial ground, which went through many iterations that I won't go into there. Yeah. And this is what it looked like. I'm just jumping ahead to show you, in case you haven't seen. This was last November, exactly just about a year ago. And this is in the, this is in the trench. And this is looking in there. There were two vaults, and I think there was even yet another one that I I wasn't told about, but was looking at the holes. Sorry?
Where was this find?
I'm sorry.
Where was the find this?
Where was the pond?
East side of the park.
It was on the east side of the park, on the road, in the road, right off the sidewalk. In fact, it probably goes under the sidewalk, I think, Mr. Chairman, a little bit.
Is that the same vault that they found in 65?
Yes, they didn't take the bulb out. They must have just moved their line. And I think somebody probably did a number because this one's virtually empty. This is just looking in. No one went into the vaults out instead last year. This is just looking in, and this one's virtually empty. This one, I don't think they got to, the broken exits. When I say they got to, I mean Con Edison didn't get to it. Okay, so now we go to the reconstruction of Washington Square Park, the very first phase, which was in 2005, I think so. 2005, phase one. There were 3 construction phases. And this was my sensitivity map that I had created for the, to show, to determine where we would be looking most specifically for anything that might be an archaeological issue. And what we had was just about those 3 buildings. We had the Keepers building over here. We had the 2, the police station and the women's comfort station. Those were the main things that I discovered. But then there was the culvert, for a wooden culvert for a Connecticut brook that we might hit. So there were lots of things to look for. But I could only look where they were going to dig, as I said. And it turns out that they were going to put a tree somewhere in here that would have would need a 6-foot deep ball, tree ball. So I was there for that. It was the very first thing. So let me just show you. This is where we were in phase 1. So we're here, within the red line with all the issues. So we weren't near the Keeper's house, and we weren't near the woman's cottage. So, we just, we were limited. This is where they were going to put a tree, in this area. So we're not sure exactly where these things are, so I was watching. And what we found was a catch basin from the 1930s renovation in the park. That day, there was something online that said, oh, they're in the park, and they found a farmhouse, and they took away 500 or more artifacts in a truck. That would have been in my dreams. Yeah, they made up all kinds of things. Constantly throughout this whole thing, there were these things I just don't understand where they were coming from, but it was very exciting to think I might have found 500 artifacts and a farmhouse, but we didn't. Ghosts, they were definitely ghosts. Could be, actually. Anyway, then our second place was a Long Waverly place, which turned out to be interesting because they were putting a tree, they were doing some excavation that would be below the 2 feet, so I was watching. And this was interesting because what this revealed to me, this is in a 7-foot deep hole, which I probably shouldn't have been in because I didn't have any shoring, but it was very safe. And this was a couple of years ago, we were quite as careful as we are now. And not that many years ago. And what I discovered is that this soil was all homogeneous, which was amazing. And I thought it was natural. Except right here at the bottom, at 6.6 feet, I cut my hand. I was cleaning this off, and I cut my finger on a piece of ceramic. So it wasn't natural. 6.5 feet down, it was fill. So, and not only that, the part that really startled me is that the fill looked absolutely natural. It all looked the same, below, side, everything. There's something about the soil, in Washington Square Park, where the sand just becomes sand. And Matt, I want you to know, I discussed this with Joe, who's a soils expert, etc. And he said it's just the way it happens sometimes. So what this meant is that if we were to find a burial, we wouldn't know, because usually if there's a burial and someone has dug a grave, the soil is then replaced and it looks different from the soil around it. We didn't have that luxury. We never knew if we were going to find a burial. The soil looked exactly the same everywhere we put a shovel or a backhoe.
Do you remember
So that proved to be interesting.
Munsell soil chart?
Pardon me?
Do you remember the Munsell number?
No, I don't remember the Munsell number, but I could have it written down somewhere. But it was all homogeneous. I mean, it was just the same everywhere, and that was startling, actually. I'd never seen that before. And in that particular dig, this is what we've had almost no artifacts except little tiny, what we call redeposited fill. they were artifacts that had come from someplace else, and they were very small because they had already broken again, and they were part of the fill. But in this particular spot on Waverly Place, in that particular hole, there was a cache of, those are not human bones, those are all animal bones and ceramics that one finds typically in 19th century fill sites. Because the fill is garbage from someplace else. 19th century fill is garbage, 18th century fill is garbage. That's how they got rid of a lot of their garbage. So, well, we did find it, and this one was on the east side of the park, and it had been sadly, in 1968, they had cut through, we were following the same line where a pipe was being replaced, and obviously in 68 they had already damaged the burial. Now, our protocol was, if you had an in situ, in place burial that had not been disturbed, it was to remain in place. We were not to take it out. We would cover it, protect it, and then backfill. In other words, leave it where it had been found. If we found what we call an isolated bone, because with all that's gone on in this park, bone would be scattered. Once you know that you've had burials, bone would be scattered, and those could be collected to be analyzed. And they were, many bones were, and they were ultimately buried back in the park. It hasn't happened yet. So we had our first intimation that yes, there definitely are still burials in the park. And then we found a complete burial, but we didn't see all of it because we could only go in a trench that was being dug. So part of it is under one side of the trench, part of it is on the other, and it was covered up with a geocloth, so that and a wooden cover, so that if anybody came upon it, they would see it again, and it would be protected. And then the whole trench was filled. Well, so what we discovered is we knew that where that mine was going, there were burials. But our major job was to find a place to put this huge reservoir for the new fountain. It was going to be very deep, 14 feet deep, rectangular, and it had to go somewhere. So we started digging, we didn't start, they started digging, the construction people, who were wonderful on this project. This phase was wonderful. They couldn't have been more accommodating and helpful, which is lovely, because it isn't always that way. And this is a shoring box that's going in because it had to go down 14 feet. That's dangerous. That box was going in, and we got down to I'm going to make this up. I'll say 13.9 feet. Home free. They could put their reservoir in, and then we found the burial right at 14 feet. So in some places it was 5 feet, which is what the other one was. Here it's 14 feet, so it tells you how different how the configuration of the park has changed. You know, how it's just so different. Now, there may be burials above this at one time, or maybe not. Maybe this was just under the old ground surface. We can't tell because the soil is exactly the same no matter where we look. Yes?
By that, do you mean the typology?
The topography has changed.
Oh.
The topography has changed. I'll give you the website. My report is online, and there's a lot of detail that I can't possibly give you. So, this is that same burial in close-up. It was a female. She had a very peculiar tooth, which was very interesting, and she had given birth at some point. But she remained in situ. She was covered up, and she was left in place at 14 feet. But they had a serious problem because they realized we were running into a lot of problems for that reservoir. So what they did is, well, let's see. So what they did is, I have to got it here. So they redesigned, and because we went to another spot where we found burials at 2.5 feet down. So it was such an up and down. So what they did was the parks engineers redesigned the reservoir so it was only 2 feet deep instead of 14 feet deep, and very widespread. And actually, it is over burials, but the burials were determined to be safe. They wouldn't have been affected by it. In other words, they're under it, but they're not affected. So this is toward the end. This is what it looked like during the first phase, where you can see all the looking from the arch, looking south. You can see a lot of dirt, et cetera, et cetera. And then this is toward the end, where they put the fountain in, and it's the end of the first phase. Okay. So now we're going to go to the second. Are you still with me?
Yeah.
We're going to go to the second phase. And every phase is different. I tell you, it's sort of like pregnancies. Everyone is different. So here we were going to go, our area of concern was here and what I'm not understanding myself is okay, this is showing, this is where we found some of the burials, this is where we found some of the burials. I mean, we had burials. So we're in the second part, where we made a remarkable discovery. This tombstone was uncovered right across the street, actually, right next to the fence, which was startling because it was about 1.5 feet down, and it told us so much, and I happen to think it's a beautiful, beautiful tombstone. It's a brownstone, and it's beautifully engraved. And I think you can read it. It says, "Here lies the body of James Jackson, who departed this life the 22nd day of September, 1799, aged 28 years, native of the county Kildare, Ireland." I mean, you can't ask for more information. And it was so shocking. And the shocking thing, of course, if someone could afford a tombstone like this, why was he in a potter's field? That was one of the major questions. Another question was he buried there? I mean, the top of it was only 1.5 feet down. Was James Jackson buried? So the question is why, and was he there? So we covered up the tombstone, and you can see the fence along Washington Square South is right here. And I was not allowed to say a word to anyone. If anyone asked me a question, I was gagged. I could not speak. So it happened the day we found it. I'm not making this up. 2 people walked by that I knew. One with a class of 8-year-olds. "Joan, what did you find?" You know, the other one, a friend of mine saying, "Oh my, what's that?" And I'm going, "I can't tell you. It was obvious." This one man said, "Tombstone, right?" Anyway, the tombstone is under there. They were covering it up. Well, a decision was made what to do. And the decision was to take it out, to remove it and conserve it. But before we did that, we excavated in front of the tombstone, going down deeper to see if Mr. Jackson was there. We went down 11 feet, I think, in stages, and there was nothing. There was no other burial, there was no Mr. Jackson. Well, the tombstone was taken out very carefully by art movers and taken up to their warehouse in the Bronx. I think the Parks Department has it now. And notice, I personally think it should be right back where it was found above ground, because my theory, just a theory, is that when they turned this into a parade ground, and they found this stone probably, that they removed it and put it here in order to mark the fact that it had been buried around. That's just my theory. I can't swear to it, and maybe it's right and maybe it's wrong, but I like it. It's sort of romantic. I like that, and I think it should be there. But they're afraid of degradation, they're afraid of vandalism, the time we live in, and I don't know what's going to happen to it. So, and that's putting it away. There it is in the box, and it's conceivable that our backhoe, which found this, might have cracked it too. It could be repaired. On the other hand, it may have happened long ago. We just don't know. But it is a beautiful stone, it's 6 feet high, and it was just stuck into the ground. You know, half of it was below ground, half of it was above ground. Well, when we walked away from that, I was walking, this was standing about 5 feet off to the east. Jackson, I could not believe it. I never noticed it before we found the tombstone, but they're a big construction material company. But that really, I mean, that was creepy. I don't know. Jackson's not a common Irish name. I was on Irish television. Everybody in County Kildare, some people in County Kildare were very excited about it. I love it. Okay, so we're looking for Mr. Jackson. I told you we looked in front. Well, we also looked behind the tombstone thinking maybe there. And what did we find? We found these 2 probably in situ burials, but we never got any further because we weren't going to disturb them if they were in place. So we have this woman and this man stacked. They're stacked. Can you see that? They're skulls.
So we're looking horizontally?
You're looking down. You're looking down in the hole.
We're looking at the top?
You're looking at the top of their heads. But what's interesting here is this one is definitely below this one, and is at a slightly different, and they were stacked. So along the edge, indeed, there were stacked burials. And I would imagine there were stacked burials other place too, because this was a a burial ground that was for how many decades? 2.5 decades? No? Yes, just a little over 2.5 decades. There's this, some people think that there were 20,000 burials here, but that seems to be the number of the African burial ground. They say 20,000 burials. I don't know where they get their number from, but it's possible. It's certainly possible. There's no way of knowing because there are no records. So there's absolutely no way. But the question was, I had stone in a potter's field. How do we get this? So that meant more research. And what my friends at the New York Historical Society, who I contacted their library, was fabulous and wonderful people, found something that explained that told me that James Jackson had died of yellow fever because there was something in their files that told how many people had died of yellow fever and had a list of them that year. So that was interesting. But this was even more interesting to me because it didn't explain why Mr. He had died of yellow fever, but why was he in the potter's field? And I came across this looking through old newspapers online, and what it told me that as of about 2 weeks before he died, before Mr. Jackson died of yellow fever, there was either an edict or a law or whatever, I've never found out what it was called, that said that anyone who died of yellow fever had to be buried in the potter's field. So you could have been the King of England if you were here and died of yellow fever. You'd have to go to the potter's field because they were so petrified of yellow fever because they thought it was highly contagious. It turns out it was the mosquito, but no one knew that for 100 years. So they were petrified. I've seen articles in the newspaper saying, don't buy feathers from the feather bed of someone who's died of yellow fever because they're contagious. Such fear, and that was why. And there were many people buried in the potter's field who were not poor or indigent. So that changed the concept of this particular potter's field completely. It also explains why there were tombstones when they did the arch and found the tombstone from 1803, because there was another yellow fever epidemic, and I guess they must have said that they had to be buried there too. So we solved the mystery. I found this very interesting because the literature says how many thousands of people died of yellow fever every year, and particularly, and what I discovered is yes, many people died of yellow fever, but that article also I just showed you also says that many people did not die of yellow fever in the potter's field at that time, but anyone who did had to be there. But the interesting thing is that only 600 some odd people, not thousands only, not an only, but it's much less than the literature will have you believe had died of yellow fever. So it was terrible, and it came every summer because the boats would come in and there'd be mosquitoes, and there was down in lower Manhattan where the city really started and came from, worked its way up. There was a lot of fill around the seaports to make land, and sunken fill and mosquitoes, and therefore yellow fever. Okay, so this is the end of phase 2 with my Mr. Jackson and everything is that. Actually, this was a wonderful project. Okay, phase 3. So now we're right across the street from where we are now. We found Mr. Jackson in the last phase, and they were changing, putting in you all know the park, they have a new comfort station and administration building. That was going. And they were going to be digging deep.
Near where the women's station was?
It's, yes, no, not near. It's built on top of the same, it's the same foundation extended. Yeah. The women's and the men's, it was both sides, yeah. Exactly right. So we were digging to see what we could find. No, I take that in my dreams. We were watching them dig to see what they might find, and going very deep. And we did come across all these bones, and it was very upsetting because it was with the backhoe. But it turns out that even though there were many bones, and they were probably one individual based on the analysis, it was missing so many parts that it obviously had been disturbed before. One of the main things was missing was its skull. Somebody must have taken it home. So we had this one individual, a female. And then we were digging alongside, we were digging in another spot, and then we turned, where we ended up digging was where there had been a comfort station built between 1828 and 1834, and we were right here along the side where there had been a basement, and partial basement. And when we went down the 10 feet we had to go down, we found this outline and bones, so we had a burial, which we left in place. So we were running into burials in a lot of spots around Washington Square, but not in the northeastern part, which was interesting, or even the southeastern part. It was mainly on the western part, and the western part I both north and south. So this is the foundation for the comfort station, the administration building, and we had to, because they were going below 2 feet, we were monitoring as they went around. This is a very shallow, it's on slab, but they had to go around the foundation, so we were monitoring. And we did find ceramics, and we did find pieces of whatever, and it was interesting, but it was typical Phil, a little more than we found in most other places, which was interesting. But this is one thing that we did find that was quite extraordinary. It was the one artifact that really grabbed my fancy, because it was a pipe bowl, kaolin pipe bowl, that obviously had been molded. And the question is, what was all this? They're wearing hats, they're obviously military, and they're holding or shaking hands. What was it and where did it come from? Well, I can figure out that it was from the mid-19th century, probably after 1860. And from what I can gather, looking at this picture from the Civil War, where they're all wearing the same, different hats, that it was probably something in commemoration of some event in the Civil War where people were getting together, and that was very exciting. I can't tell you any more than that, though. So this is what, well, that's saved. Those artifacts were saved. They're actually in the new repository. If you've read about the new New York City repository, I don't know if you know about that. There's a new New York City repository. There is named Nan A. Rothschild repository after one of our archaeologists. Her family donated a space, and all city-owned artifacts from city-owned property are going to be stored there for research, for whatever. You can look it up online. It's called the New York City Repository, the Archaeological Repository, and it's quite wonderful. The only problem is there are other artifacts that are not from the city. There are artifacts from private kind of projects, and those don't have a copy. So one of my aims in life is to find somebody very rich, anybody here, who would like to donate a space, and we can make a repository that will be named after them. No, well, if you know anybody, do let me know, because we really do need it. Because how should I put this? Many of the artifacts these days are city-owned property, but not all. And we do have these fantastic artifacts. One of my sites was a site called 175 Water Street, my very first site, where I found a 100-foot ship in landfill, and we had 310,000 artifacts because it was landfill, and there probably were, I can't even tell you how many more that were not actually cataloged one by one. And they were stored at the South Street Seaport Museum, and now they and other artifacts from sites like that, this was a private development, have gone to the New York State Museum in Albany, which is lovely. A lovely facility, but it should be in New York. This is where it came from, and people did do research. Now they have to go to Albany, which is not easy. It sort of was heartbreaking, but at least it has a good one. Okay, so we were here. Mr. Jackson was here. We looked through here, as I said. We also had a burial there. We had a burial here. We had a burial up here. I never got to see, we were never in the area where the keeper's cottage was, and there also was a well that was dug at the same time. Chances are that well was there, but they weren't doing anything where I would see it, so where I had to look. And we did also look in here. We did not find too much. And this is Mr. Ludlow's property up here. The farmhouse with the 500 and whatever, 1,000 artifacts. Anyway, nothing ever happened here. So this is Washington Square Park, about 3 years ago, and this is the new comfort station and administration building right across the street, and that's Washington Square Park.